Dan Carcillo broke bones for the NHL. He dropped gloves, took hits, and did the job nobody wanted, but everybody needed. 2 Stanley Cups with Chicago, 12 suspensions. Then, his best friend died at 35 with a shattered mind, and Carcillo did the one thing hockey never forgives. He told the truth out loud.
Monty went through some, really trying times, and I got to see it firsthand. That lockout year, he suffered a concussion, and the team had put him on waivers.
Here's what it cost him. Carcillo grew up in King City, Ontario, inside a hockey culture that measured your worth by how much punishment you could absorb and how much more you were willing to give back. He wasn't the fastest skater on the ice, and he wasn't going to dazzle anyone with highlight reel goals, but he understood from a young age that there was a specific role the sport needed filled, and he was built to fill it. The Pittsburgh Penguins drafted him 73rd overall in 2003, and from the moment he entered professional hockey, the path was clear. You fight, you protect, you make the other team afraid to touch your guys, and you do not complain about what it does to you. By the 2007-08 season with the Phoenix Coyotes, Carcillo led the entire NHL in penalty minutes with 324, which meant he was spending more time in the box than almost anyone in the league, and wearing that number like a badge of honor. He moved through rosters the way enforcers always do. Phoenix to Philadelphia to Chicago, and at every stop, the assignment was identical, and the expectations never changed. In Philadelphia, he helped take the Flyers all the way to the 2010 Stanley Cup final, proving that his kind of player still had a place deep in the postseason when the stakes were at their highest. But it was in Chicago where everything came together. Carcillo won his first Stanley Cup with the Blackhawks in 2013, and then came back for a second in 2015, even though by that point his body was barely holding up, and he didn't play a single game in the playoff run. His name still went on the cup because the league's own rules said he had earned it during the regular season, and that tells you something about the kind of contribution he was making even when the cameras weren't catching it. The fans in Chicago loved what he brought to the room, and opposing players knew that when Carcillo was in the lineup, the night was going to be physical, uncomfortable, and long. Here's the part of the enforcer's life that nobody puts in the recruiting pitch. The NHL needs these players the way a construction site needs heavy machinery. Essential while the job is running, forgotten the moment the project wraps up. The league will celebrate your toughness in highlight packages and playoff montages, and coaches will tell you how valuable your presence is in the dressing room, but the second your body can't perform the function they hired it for, you're on your own. There's no transition plan, no structured off-ramp into the next chapter of your life, just a brief phone call from the Players Association to check in, and then nothing. Carcillo himself would later say that when he asked retired players what the NHLPA's exit program actually looked like, not a single one of them could tell him what it was. But in 2013, standing in that locker room with champagne still dripping off the Stanley Cup, none of that mattered yet. He was winning. The system was still rewarding him for doing exactly what it asked, and there was no reason to believe the deal would ever stop working in his favor. Over the course of his 9-season career, Carcillo sustained 7 documented concussions, tore the ACL in his left knee, and accumulated the kind of chronic pain that doesn't show up on a stat sheet, but follows you into every room for the rest of your life. He later went to the Carrick Institute for Neurological Evaluation and was told he was one of the worst traumatic brain injury cases they had ever seen, which meant that the damage wasn't just from a few bad hits, it was the accumulation of years of subconcussive blows, bare-knuckle fights, and a league that routinely allowed players to return to the ice before their brains had fully healed. Hockey is the only major team sport where you're allowed to punch another person in the face with your bare fists, and Carcillo did that job for nearly a decade without ever being told what the long-term price would be. But the injuries to his own body were not what finally broke through. He was watching what happened to the people around him. Bob Probert, one of the most iconic enforcers in hockey history, was gone at 45 from a heart attack in 2010, and his autopsy confirmed CTE in his brain. Then, in the summer of 2011, 3 more enforcers passed within 4 months of each other. Derek Bugard at 28, Rick Rippon at 27, and Wade Belak at 35. All 3 were later found to have had the same disease. These were not strangers to Carcillo. These were men who had done the exact same job he did, carried the same weight, and were gone before they ever got the chance to build a life outside the sport. Then came the loss that changed everything. On February 15, 2015, Carcillo's closest friend in hockey, Steve Montador, was found in his home in Mississauga, Ontario. He was 35 years old. Montador had suffered a career-altering concussion in 2012 and was bought out by the Blackhawks the following year. Carcillo watched his friend deteriorate in real time. Memory loss, the extra sets of keys for the same lock because he kept forgetting where he put them, the days spent alone with the blinds drawn because the symptoms were too much to face. When Montador's brain was examined after his passing, researchers found widespread CTE so advanced that it resembled what you would expect to see in a 90-year-old dementia patient. He had played 571 NHL games across 10 seasons, and nobody in the league had prepared him for what was coming. 2 months later, on April 22, 2015, while still technically on the Blackhawks roster recovering from his own concussion, Carcillo sat down in front of a camera for the Players Tribune and said what nobody in hockey was supposed to say out loud. He talked about Montador, the depression, about the complete absence of any real support system for players leaving the game. He later told reporters, "The unspoken sentiment is that you don't talk about this kind of stuff in the hockey world. It can be seen as a distraction." He talked anyway. And in hockey, that kind of honesty doesn't come without a price. The response was immediate and overwhelmingly supportive. Fans, journalists, and athletes across multiple sports reached out. But the institution Carcillo was actually talking to, the NHL itself, responded with something far more calculated than outrage. They responded with distance. Weeks later, just before the 2015 Stanley Cup final opener, NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman stood in front of cameras and repeated the league's official position that a connection between concussions and CTE had not been established. Carcillo had just buried his best friend after watching his mind fall apart for 3 years, and the commissioner of the league that employed both of them was telling the world that the science wasn't settled. Doctors and brain trauma researchers openly called that position ridiculous, but the NHL held the line. What made it worse was what the league already knew and chose to sit on. Internal emails later revealed in court showed that Dr. Ruben Echmendia, the chair of the NHL's own concussion study group, had written to Deputy Commissioner Bill Daley and NHL lawyer Julie Grand back in August 2012, warning that bringing this topic up is akin to touching the third rail, referring to the long-term consequences of head injuries and the relationship to CTE and depression. He recommended a long-term study on retired players. The league commissioned a task force the following year to look into it, and according to Grand's own deposition testimony, the result was nothing. Not one proposal, not one draft, not a single action item. The NHL had all the information, had all the internal recommendation, and chose to do absolutely nothing with it. For Carcillo, the cost of speaking was personal and professional at the same time. He went from being a celebrated two-time Cup champion to someone the hockey establishment treated as a problem. In June 2018, he and former player Nick Boynton filed a lawsuit against the NHL, alleging the league had withheld information about the risks of brain damage and had allowed and encouraged concussed players to return to the ice. When the league reached a settlement later that year offering retired players roughly $22,000 each with no admission of liability, Carcillo publicly urged every former player to reject it. He called the number disrespectful and said on the record, "If 22 is enough for you and you need it, then go ahead. I won't judge anybody who takes it. But I also say this so that people understand why it's such a disrespectful number, because right now the NHL doesn't feel threatened." He refused to take the money and pushed forward with his own individual lawsuit, which, as of 2025, remains unresolved. And here's the part that should sit with you the longest. When Carcillo started speaking publicly, he said that dozens of current and former players reached out to him privately to say they were struggling with the same issues. Dozens, but almost none of them went on the record. He himself described the NHL as very much a fear-based league, where the unwritten rule is simple: walk on eggshells, don't ask questions, and if you don't agree with how you're being treated, there's always someone younger and hungrier ready to step in and keep quiet. The system doesn't need to silence every player individually. It only needs to make an example out of one. 4 years after retiring from the NHL, Carcillo had spent nearly $200,000 of his own money trying to find relief from the depression, light sensitivity, and cognitive damage caused by a decade of traumatic brain injuries. Traditional treatments weren't working, and he has spoken openly about reaching a point where he was considering ending his own life. He couldn't look at his phone because of the light sensitivity and wanted nothing to do with his infant son because his brain couldn't handle the stimulation. What pulled him back was psilocybin. After reading a study from Imperial College London on psychedelic-assisted therapy for brain trauma, Carcillo pursued the treatment himself and described the result as transformative. That personal experience led him to co-found Wesana Health, a life sciences company focused on developing psilocybin-based treatments for traumatic brain injury. He also established the Chapter 5 Foundation in 2015, named after Steve Montador's jersey number with the Blackhawks, dedicated to helping former players navigate the transition out of hockey and access support for post-concussion syndrome, anxiety, and depression. And in 2020, he filed a class action lawsuit against the Canadian Hockey League on behalf of minors who had been subjected to hazing and physical and sexual abuse in junior hockey. He told reporters at the time, "I was one of those kids when I played in the OHL. I know there are many more just like me." So Carcillo found a way forward. But here's the question that matters more. Did the league? The NHL now has updated concussion protocols and spotters who can pull players from games. There are mental health resources that did not exist a decade ago. But that settlement came with no admission that hockey causes long-term neurological harm, and the number it put on a career's worth of brain damage was $22,000. Carcillo called it disrespectful. The NFL admitted the connection between football and CTE in 2017 and paid $700 million. As of 2025, the NHL has still made no such admission. Carcillo, Nick Boynton, and the families of Steve Montador and Todd Ewan have all refused the settlement and are pursuing individual lawsuits that remain unresolved. And here is the question the league still has not answered. How many former enforcers, the men who did the job nobody else wanted, who absorbed the punishment that kept stars safe, has the NHL actually contacted to ask how they're doing? What does long-term care look like for a player who gave his body to the league and walked away with nothing but chronic pain and a brain that no longer works the way it should? And when the next young player with fists and heart and no exit plan comes along, what exactly will be different for him? The NHL loved Dan Carcillo when he was throwing fists and protecting their investments. They loved him when he was hoisting the Stanley Cup in Chicago. They loved him right up until he sat down in front of a camera and said the thing they had been paying everyone not to say. And the fact that it took this long for anyone to listen, that's the real story. If this one hit you, subscribe to Skates and Scars, because this isn't the last time hockey's silence needs breaking.